They called him the runt, the smallest of four, the one who always lagged behind on the icy ridges, the one who shivered first, stumbled first, cried first. His siblings were stronger, louder, bolder, and yet his mother had always watched him the closest, not with worry, but with something quieter, something that trusted he would need her lessons most. It had begun like any other northern winter: bitter winds, blinding snow, long treks across silent tundra. But when the storm came, it wasn't like the others. It roared from the mountains, swallowing the sun in a matter of minutes. The family tried to stay close, huddled under a low cliff edge, his mother's body shielding them from the worst of it. But the wind was merciless. The snow didn't fall, it attacked. In the chaos, he was swept away. One moment pressed against his mother's belly, the next airborne, tumbling through white. No scent, no sound, no warmth, just cold and loss. When he came to, he was alone and very, very small. He lay in the snow for a long time, barely breathing. The wind had quieted, but not his fear. Every instinct told him to stay down, to wait for his mother to find him. But the silence stretched too long, and in that stillness, something older stirred in him. Not strength, not courage, but memory. His mother's voice, soft but steady. If you ever get lost, don't panic. Feel the wind, smell the air, trust your paws. They remember more than you think. So he stood, shaking, alone, but moving. The snow was deeper than him. He had to lift his legs high with every step. His breath came fast, leaving puffs of steam behind him. The sky had turned gray again, but he kept going, not because he knew where to go, but because he couldn't forget what she had told him. He found no shelter that first night, just a hollow beneath a bent pine where he curled into a ball and shook. His tiny body couldn't hold heat. But something else kept him alive. The pull, the invisible thread that stretched from his chest to something far beyond the horizon. For the next 2 days, he moved when the light allowed it. He scavenged for food, licking frost from branches, chewing frozen bark. He found tracks, none of them hers. He called out, but the wind swallowed his voice. And yet, he walked. Because deep down, he remembered. He remembered the scent of the wind when she nuzzled him. He remembered the rhythm of her footsteps in the snow. He remembered her warmth and the way she always turned back to make sure he was close, and it became a compass. Not perfect, but enough. On the third day, a shadow appeared ahead, moving slowly, limping. His heart jumped. But it wasn't her. It was an old male bear, gaunt and bleeding. The cub froze. The male stopped too. Their eyes met across the whiteness. For a long second, the world held its breath. And then, the old bear dipped his head, not to attack, but to pass, a silent agreement between two survivors. We are not enemies today. The cub's world widened. Not all threats were enemies. Not all strangers meant harm. That night, he slept inside the shell of a fallen tree. The storm returned, howling through the forest, but he stayed dry, safe, warmer than before. He began to understand survival wasn't just about strength. It was about remembering, adapting, believing. On the 5th day, he found a trail, one he recognized, not by sight, but by smell. A familiar mix of crushed pine, wet earth, and something softer, something he had always known. He didn't stop to question. He just ran. He ran until his legs gave out, until he collapsed beneath the very ridge where his mother had once taught him how to climb. The snow was thinner there. The trees stood like sentinels, watching, waiting, and then he heard it. Not the storm, not the wind, but her, a low, aching call, carried across the frost. He answered with everything he had left. And when she appeared, limping, bleeding, but alive, it was not as a rescuer. It was as someone who had also remembered. They had both done the unthinkable. They had found their way back, to each other, to the home they carried in one another, to the lesson that the smallest voice, the weakest step, the quietest memory, can be loud enough to guide you through anything. Because that's what love does when everything else is gone. It echoes. Not through words or signs, but through the very way we move when no one is watching. In the bend of a paw print retraced, in the pause before a step, remembering how she once looked back to wait, in the stillness that says, "You're not lost, you're just remembering the way." And so he walked slower now, not from weakness, but from reverence. Every fallen branch, every familiar scent carried weight. This was not just a forest, it was a living map, written in the language only the heart understands. And Dora the cub, once just a follower, had become the one who led, not others, but himself. He learned how to find food where nothing seemed to grow. He learned how to feel the wind not as a threat, but as a guide. He learned that the howl of night could carry comfort too, because it meant the world was still breathing with him. And every lesson, every scar, every silent night he survived, taught him not just how to return, but why he needed to. Because there was a part of his mother in the way he endured, in the way he didn't give up, even when the world asked him to, in the way he believed that if he just kept going, love might be waiting. That belief, that small, trembling thread of faith, was more powerful than any path, any instinct, any rule nature had written. It was the kind of belief that doesn't come from strength, but from being held once, just once, so completely that the memory of it can light your way through the darkest place. And that's what he followed now. Not her voice, not her scent, but her love, because it was still with him, because it had always been. Not as a memory frozen in time, but as something alive, woven into every choice he made to keep moving forward. It was there when he chose to sleep beneath the same leaning pines she once led him past. It was there when he veered left at the split in the path, without knowing why, only that it felt like home. It was there in the warmth that rose in his chest each time he dared to believe that the world hadn't forgotten him completely, that maybe she hadn't either. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was remembering with his entire body. He carried her in the way he lowered his head when he drank from the stream, in the way he pressed his paw into the snow, not just to leave a mark, but to feel the earth that once held her weight. He began to understand that some journeys aren't about distance, but about becoming. That every step he took toward home was also a step toward the part of him that had always known how to find it. He didn't need to see her to feel her there, in the hush of the trees, in the hush between his breaths, in the hush between each choice to keep going. The world had tried to erase the trail, bury it in snow and silence. But love is louder than that. It doesn't vanish. It waits, quietly, patiently, until we are strong enough to listen. And so he listened, not with his ears, but with his hope. And that hope grew teeth, grew spine, grew legs strong enough to climb frozen hills, and a heart soft enough to keep believing, even when the forest turned its coldest face. Because every time he fell, he remembered her lifting him. Every time the cold closed in, he remembered her warmth. And every time he doubted, he remembered the way she looked at him, as if he was already enough. It made him stand taller now, not to look bigger, but to feel braver. Because deep down, even if the den was empty, even if the forest gave no welcome, even if the sky held no signs, he had made it this far. And he knew that meant something. He had survived not by accident, but because love had carved a path inside him so clear, so unbreakable, that not even the storm could silence it. Not anymore. Not ever again. Because something had shifted, not in the snow, not in the trees, but in him. Where once there was a void, a trembling fear of being too small, too weak, too alone. Now there was fire. Quiet, steady fire. It didn't roar. It didn't need to. It pulsed inside him like her heartbeat once had when he curled against her side. It moved through his veins with every step forward, whispering that courage didn't have to be loud to be real. That sometimes the softest parts of us are what carry us through the hardest places. And this frozen world that had once tried to steal everything from him, was no longer in control. He wasn't just reacting to its cruelty anymore. He was answering it, with memory, with devotion, with the kind of strength that can only be born in the aftermath of loss. Each crunch of his paws in the snow was a declaration. I remember, I'm still here. I'm coming home. He stopped apologizing to the silence. He stopped shrinking beneath the shadows of the trees. He realized that survival was not shame, that pain did not make him lesser, that needing help once didn't mean he was broken. He was shaped, yes, changed, but not ruined, not forgotten. She had placed something inside him too sacred for the storm to take. And now he was beginning to understand that the way home wasn't just about finding a den or retracing old paths. It was about choosing to live like he was still loved, still worthy, still enough. It was about lifting his head not because someone told him he could, but because he believed it now, because she had believed it first. And belief, real belief, plants roots even in the most frozen earth. The world was still cold. The trees still groaned. But he walked like warmth was waiting, like family wasn't a memory, but a direction. And even if no one else saw the miracle of that, it didn't matter. He wasn't walking for applause. He was walking for her, for himself, for the story that hadn't ended yet. And deep inside, where grief had once lived like a storm, something else had started to grow. Something softer, something stronger, something that looked a lot like home. Not because it matched what he remembered, but because it honored what he had lost. Because home wasn't just a place anymore. It wasn't where they had lived, or where they had last been whole. It was the feeling he carried now in every brave step forward. It was the warmth he created by daring to believe that what was gone could still guide him, that what had been broken could still shape something beautiful. That love, real love, never disappears. It simply waits to be remembered. And in that remembering, it becomes a compass. He didn't need the path to be easy. He didn't need the storm to stop. What he needed was already inside him. Planted in the moment she had looked at him with her final breath and made a silent promise he hadn't understood then, but could feel now, that he wasn't alone, that he had never been alone, that no matter how far he strayed or how cold the world became, her love would rise like a sun inside him and melt what fear had frozen. And so he kept walking, through wind that tried to push him back, through shadows that whispered he was still too small, too slow, too lost. But they didn't know what he knew now. That strength isn't measured in size. That bravery isn't about being unafraid. It's about choosing to keep moving even when everything inside you screams to stop. It's about hearing your mother's voice not in the air, but in your bones, and trusting that where she once stood, you now rise, because she had made him more than her son. She had made him a memory bearer, a promise keeper, a storyteller. And this journey wasn't about survival anymore. It was about honoring that legacy. It was about walking through the world in a way that let her love keep existing. So he walked, not for safety, not for shelter, but for home. Not as a destination, but as a direction, a feeling stitched into every breath he took, every paw print pressed into the snow. Because home, he had learned, wasn't somewhere you arrive. It's something you carry. It's in the way your heart whispers when to turn, in the way your soul recognizes softness, even when your body is tired. And as he moved forward, with nothing but cold behind him and uncertainty ahead, he realized he wasn't just retracing steps. He was making new ones that honored the past without being trapped in it, ones that dared to believe that what he had once known could still exist in some different, maybe even better way. Because home wasn't about going back. It was about bringing love forward. And that love, his mother's love, never wavered. It had become something larger now, a warmth he felt even in the sharpest wind, a strength that curled around him when the sky threatened to fall, a light that flickered in his chest and reminded him, over and over again, that he was not weak, that he had never been weak. He had been chosen to survive, to carry the memory, to keep the bond alive, not through blood alone, but through choice, through devotion, through the simple act of continuing on. Because sometimes the ones left behind aren't lost. They're entrusted with everything that mattered most, with love that didn't end at goodbye, with strength passed down in silence, with a promise that, even if the world forgets, they will remember. And as he climbed the ridge and looked out across the frozen valley, he felt her, not in the wind, not in the trees, but in himself. She was there, in the way he stood taller now, in the way he breathed deeper, in the way he didn't stop, because she had taught him how to go on. And that was home, not the place, not the shelter, but the knowing. The inner compass forged not by maps, but by love, by presence, by the sound of a voice that once soothed his cries and the rhythm of footsteps that had always circled him in protection. He didn't need to see her to know she had been real. He didn't need to touch her to feel that she still was. Every inch of his small body had become a vessel for what she had poured into him. Patience, courage, that unshakable fire that whispered, "You are not alone," even when no one else stood beside him. And so, the snow no longer swallowed him. It bowed to him. The cold didn't bite, it carved, shaped him into something more than a survivor, more than the smallest, more than the one who was left behind. It shaped him into a bearer of memory, a living testament that the truest strength doesn't scream, it endures. That what is carried in the heart cannot be taken by time, nor erased by loss. It was with him, pulsing beneath the frost, walking with him as surely as any shadow. He wasn't just going home, he was becoming it. With each step, he rewrote what it meant to belong. Not waiting to be rescued, not hoping someone stronger might appear, but walking, breathing, remembering, and building a path where others like him might one day follow. A path paved in silence, yes, but also in resolve. In the fierce, steady kind of hope that doesn't falter when the winds howl, because it was born in the storm. In the kind of faith that believes love is never wasted, because even when it feels gone, it lives on, in the next brave step forward, and the next. Each one a whisper from the past saying, "Keep going." Not because it would be easy, but because it would matter. Because each frozen hill he climbed wasn't just terrain, it was proof. Proof that even the smallest, even the weakest, can carry the fire of something greater. Of a love that didn't vanish with the storm, but was woven into his bones like warmth that never left. He wasn't lost, he was remembering. He wasn't broken, he was returning. He passed the tree where she had once stood, her shadow long and protective over him. He passed the rock where his siblings had first opened their eyes. He passed the hollow where she had curled herself around them in the dead of night just to keep them breathing. These places weren't markers. They were prayers, echoes, reminders that what they had shared didn't die with the silence. It waited, it pulsed in the stillness, and it rose with him now, a shield of memory pressed against his shivering chest. His paws no longer stumbled. They pressed with certainty, because he knew what waited at the end of this journey was not the same home he'd left, but a version built from his own courage, a place not marked by walls or warmth, but by the decision to return, to believe in something he couldn't see, to follow what had once held him. Because the truest homes are not inherited, they are reclaimed, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, until the past and the present meet again, not in the form of rescue, but in reunion. Not the loud kind, not the kind wrapped in celebration or witnessed by a crowd, but the quiet kind, the one that happens in the still air between two hearts that never stop searching for each other. The kind where no words are needed, because everything that mattered had already been said, in the warmth once shared, in the paths remembered, in the invisible thread that stretched across miles of frozen silence and pulled him home. She was there, not where he expected, not waiting like a storybook mother beneath the same sky, but close, so close. Her scent lingered in the snow, her presence hummed in the wind, and then from the shadows, a movement, slow, careful, and then two eyes, tired but bright. Recognition before sound, devotion before breath. She had survived too, not by moving, but by hoping, not by fleeing, but by waiting. And now they stood, not as what they were, but as what they become, survivors of something greater than storm or hunger, carriers of something deeper than instinct, a mother and her son, lost, changed, but never truly apart. The moment didn't need to be big to be monumental. It didn't need noise to mean everything. It just needed to happen. The nudge of a nose, the press of a body too cold to hold strength, leaning into the one who had once carried it with ease. The way they simply stayed, because staying was the bravest act of all. Staying meant believing that love was still possible, even after everything. And in that staying, they wrote a new story, one not defined by what they had lost, but by what they had dared to find again. Because finding each other again wasn't just a stroke of chance, it was a testament to memory, to instinct, to something deeper than either of them could name. It was the way his tiny paw prints had followed trails long covered by snow, and yet somehow still warm beneath. It was the way her body, exhausted and shaking, still found the strength to rise one more time. Not to run, but to open herself to the impossible. Reunion after despair. Their bodies touched, tentative at first, like reaching back into a dream. But with every second, the distance between their hearts unraveled. The silence filled with something ancient and undeniable. They hadn't just endured the cold, they had carried a piece of each other through it. And now those pieces were home again. There was no celebration, no audience, just the wind, softening its howl as if it too understood that something sacred was unfolding. The storm hadn't won, the wilderness hadn't broken them. What remained was something storms couldn't reach. The bond between a mother and her child, tested but unbroken. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a rebirth. And from that moment on, every step they took was taken together. Not out of necessity, but out of choice. Not driven by fear, but guided by love. He had returned, not as the weakest, but as the bravest. And she had stayed, not because she was strong, but because love had taught her that staying is strength. Not waiting to be rescued, not hoping someone stronger might appear, but walking, breathing, remembering, and building a path where others like him might one day follow. A path paved in silence, yes, but also in resolve. In the fierce, steady kind of hope that doesn't falter when the winds howl, because it was born in the storm. In the kind of faith that believes love is never wasted, because even when it feels gone, it lives on, in the next brave step forward, and the next. Each one a whisper from the past saying, keep going. Not because it would be easy, but because it would matter. Because each frozen hill he climbed wasn't just terrain, it was proof. Proof that even the smallest, even the weakest, can carry the fire of something greater. Of a love that didn't vanish with the storm, but was woven into his bones like warmth that never left. He wasn't lost, he was remembering. He wasn't broken, he was returning. He passed the tree where she had once stood, her shadow long and protective over him. He passed the rock where his siblings had first opened their eyes. He passed the hollow where she had curled herself around them in the dead of night just to keep them breathing. These places weren't markers. They were prayers, echoes, reminders that what they had shared didn't die with the silence. It waited, it pulsed in the stillness, and it rose with him now, a shield of memory pressed against his shivering chest. His paws no longer stumbled. They pressed with certainty, because he knew what waited at the end of this journey was not the same home he'd left, but a version built from his own courage, a place not marked by walls or warmth, but by the decision to return, to believe in something he couldn't see, to follow what had once held him. Because the truest homes are not inherited, they are reclaimed, step by step, heartbeat by heartbeat, until the past and the present meet again, not in the form of rescue, but in reunion. Not the loud kind, not the kind wrapped in celebration or witnessed by a crowd, but the quiet kind, the one that happens in the still air between two hearts that never stop searching for each other. The kind where no words are needed, because everything that mattered had already been said, in the warmth once shared, in the paths remembered, in the invisible thread that stretched across miles of frozen silence and pulled him home. She was there, not where he expected, not waiting like a storybook mother beneath the same sky, but close, so close. Her scent lingered in the snow, her presence hummed in the wind, and then from the shadows, a movement, slow, careful, and then two eyes, tired but bright. Recognition before sound, devotion before breath. She had survived too, not by moving, but by hoping, not by fleeing, but by waiting. And now they stood, not as what they were, but as what they'd become, survivors of something greater than storm or hunger, carriers of something deeper than instinct, a mother and her son, lost, changed, but never truly apart. The moment didn't need to be big to be monumental. It didn't need noise to mean everything. It just needed to happen. The nudge of a nose, the press of a body too cold to hold strength, leaning into the one who had once carried it with ease. The way they simply stayed, because staying was the bravest act of all. Staying meant believing that love was still possible, even after everything. And in that staying, they wrote a new story, one not defined by what they had lost, but by what they had dared to find again. Because finding each other again wasn't just a stroke of chance. It was a testament to memory, to instinct, to something deeper than either of them could name. It was the way his tiny paw prints had followed trails long covered by snow, and yet somehow still warm beneath. It was the way her body, exhausted and shaking, still found the strength to rise one more time. Not to run, but to open herself to the impossible. Reunion after despair. Their bodies touched, tentative at first, like reaching back into a dream. But with every second, the distance between their hearts unraveled. The silence filled with something ancient and undeniable. They hadn't just endured the cold, they had carried a piece of each other through it. And now those pieces were home again. There was no celebration, no audience, just the wind, softening its howl as if it too understood that something sacred was unfolding. The storm hadn't won, the wilderness hadn't broken them. What remained was something storms couldn't reach. The bond between a mother and her child, tested but unbroken. It wasn't just a reunion, it was a rebirth. And from that moment on, every step they took was taken together. Not out of necessity, but out of choice. Not driven by fear, but guided by love. He had returned, not as the weakest, but as the bravest. And she had stayed, not because she was strong, but because love had taught her that staying is strength. Because what they had rebuilt was not the same as what was lost. It was stronger, tested, earned. It was the kind of bond that could only exist on the other side of breaking. And as she pressed her head gently against his, she wasn't just comforting him, she was anchoring herself to memory, to purpose, to the truth that no matter how far apart they had been, they were always on their way back to each other. Even when the world made it impossible, even when the cold bit deep and the sky gave no sign, even when the footprints were buried beneath storms and time, and nothing looked familiar anymore, something inside had remembered. Not the path, but the promise. Not the direction, but the pull. The kind of pull only love can leave behind, echoing in bone and breath, urging forward when everything else said, stop. That's what guided him. Not instinct, not even survival, but the quiet certainty that somewhere out there, she was still waiting, still hoping, still believing he was worth waiting for. And now here they were. Not just alive, but whole again. Scarred, yes. Weathered, yes. Changed undeniably. But whole, in ways they had never been before the loss, before the fear, before the journey. He wasn't the same little one who had once stumbled behind her on unsteady legs. And she wasn't the same mother who had once thought she had to be everything all at once to protect him. What they had become was something even greater. Two souls who had been broken and rebuilt separately, only to find that their love was the mortar that made them strong enough to find each other again. And in that reunion, they reminded the world of something it often forgets, that healing is not forgetting, that strength isn't loud, that sometimes the bravest thing anyone can do is keep going, keep hoping, keep searching. Not because the world makes it easy, but because love makes it necessary. Because some bonds are carved so deeply into the soul that time, distance, and even despair can't wear them down. Because no matter how far he'd wandered, no matter how frozen his little paws had become, or how lost the world around him had seemed. His heart had remembered the rhythm of hers, the lull of her breath, the warmth of her presence, the way her body had once curled around his on cold nights, and how her eyes had always looked for him first, even in chaos. That kind of love doesn't disappear. It imprints. It stays in the smallest movements, in the way he tilted his head at unfamiliar sounds, in the way he paused before stepping into a new clearing, half expecting her to be waiting there. It stayed in the ache, in the longing, and eventually in the reunion. And when he finally reached her, when his trembling body pressed against hers and her arms closed tightly around him like a shield, like a prayer, everything they had endured collapsed into silence. Not the empty kind, but the sacred kind. The kind of silence that only exists when something holy has returned. They didn't need to speak. They didn't need to explain. Every scar told its own story. Every tear that fell down her face told his. And in that stillness, surrounded by a world that had nearly swallowed them whole, they became something new. Not just mother and son, not just survivors, but proof. Living proof that even when the world breaks you apart, love can be strong enough to bring you home again. Even if that home looks different, even if everything around you has changed, because sometimes it's not about returning to what was, it's about rebuilding with what's left. And in her arms, he realized he wasn't the same frightened cub who had been swallowed by the storm. He had grown in the silence, in the hunger, in the ache of missing her. And she had carried 1,000 suns of grief in his absence. But she had never let go of the hope. She had searched every gust of wind for his scent, watched every shadow for his return, and whispered promises to the stars that she would not stop waiting. Together, they didn't speak of the days lost. They didn't count the nights apart. They simply held each other until the shaking stopped, until the memory of cold turned into the certainty of warmth, until they could walk again, slowly side by side, not back to where they had been, but forward into something even stronger. A new beginning written by survival, but bound by something deeper. Because home wasn't a place, it was a feeling, a presence, a pulse that says, you are not alone anymore. And with every step they took through the snow-covered forest, with every glance exchanged and every heartbeat that matched, the forest seemed to lean in and listen. Because stories like theirs didn't need to be shouted, they just needed to be lived, quietly, fiercely. Together they moved, not as they had before, but with something new in every step. Not with the urgency of survival, but with the rhythm of something reclaimed, something sacred. The snow beneath them no longer felt like a threat, but a path. One carved by resilience, by the soft, steady thrum of hearts that had once beat alone and now echoed in harmony. She watched him closely, this cub who had been lost to the storm. And what she saw wasn't just her child. It was a miracle stitched together by memory and instinct, by everything the cold had tried to take and failed. His fur was rougher now, his body lean from the fight, but his eyes, they still carried her in them. Every step he took was a quiet declaration that love had endured, that it had not broken, that even when scattered by the wind, it had found its way back. And as they reached the clearing, the same place they had last seen each other, there was no need for words, no grand reunion, just a long, steady breath shared between them. The kind that says, I knew you'd come back. I never stopped believing you would. Because what had survived between them wasn't fragile. It had grown sharper in the silence, deeper in the waiting, and stronger with every heartbeat that had whispered, I'm still here. That was the power of staying. The kind of staying that doesn't depend on conditions or convenience. The kind that outlasts the storm and rebuilds what it once feared lost. And now, step by step, they walked forward into the kind of future only love could create. And that future didn't need to be loud or grand. It didn't need perfect skies or warm weather. It only needed this: two bodies side by side breathing in the same rhythm. A mother who had refused to give up. A cub who had followed the memory of her heartbeat through the dark. And in their steps, something ancient moved too. Something older than fear, older than the storm, older than loss. It was the knowledge that love, once true, becomes a compass, one that never forgets the way home. Each snowflake that landed on their fur was no longer a threat, but a reminder of all they had survived, of how the cold had tried to silence their bond, but only made it louder. The winds that once howled now moved around them like witnesses, as if even the mountain air understood what it was seeing, not just a reunion, but a resurrection. And as they pressed forward, the world didn't change, but they had. And that made all the difference, because now the cub walked not behind her, but with her, shoulder to shoulder. Not afraid of the path ahead, because it was made by devotion, not worried about the past, because it had already been forgiven. All that mattered now was what they could build with what was left. That kind of love didn't need words to be understood. It just needed to be seen, felt, chosen. Again and again, their footsteps wrote a new story into the snow, one of return, of refusal to be broken, of choosing each other no matter how far they had been pulled apart. The cub no longer looked back. He didn't need to. What had once been fear was now memory, and what had once been doubt was now faith. Every time he stumbled, her shadow was there to steady him, not by carrying but by walking beside, teaching through presence, through consistency, through the quiet power of showing up, even when the world said to run. They passed the hollow tree where they had once taken shelter, the ridge where her call had echoed until it broke, unanswered. And still she had not stopped calling. That call had lived in his bones. It had found its way through the blizzard. It had become his direction. And now that voice was no longer something to follow. It was something to walk with. And as they climbed, something else changed. The world didn't grow easier, but it grew clearer. They could feel the strength in each other's pace. Not rushed, not desperate, but deliberate, alive, reclaimed. Because some journeys are not about escape. They are about returning to who you were before the world tried to unmake you. And some reunions are not about finding what was lost, but about becoming someone who is strong enough to hold it when it's found again. And so, step by step, they did not just return to each other, they returned to themselves. The cub, no longer shivering and lost, now walked with the quiet confidence of someone who had been chosen, searched for, fought for. His mother didn't just guide him home. She gave him the knowing that he was worth coming back for. And in every breath she took beside him, in every glance exchanged under the wide snow-laced sky, that truth deepened. It didn't need to be said. It had already been proven. The cold didn't leave. The path wasn't suddenly smooth, but the difference now was who walked it and how. Two hearts, once torn apart by storm and silence, now moved together like they never meant to be anything else. Her strength didn't just shield him, it awakened him. And his survival didn't just mean he lived, it meant he would now carry this bond in every step forward. Because home, they realized, isn't a place you find, it's a truth you feel. And once it finds you too, you never walk alone again. And from that moment on, every tree felt less like a stranger and more like a witness. Every gust of wind no longer stung like before, it whispered memories of how far they'd come. The cub no longer startled at shadows or flinched at silence. He had learned what love felt like when it returned with force, with purpose, with a vow etched not in words, but in presence. He had been alone, yes, but only long enough to know how powerful it was when someone came back for you. And his mother, she no longer searched the horizon with panic in her chest. Instead, she moved with a calm fierceness, her body no longer just surviving, but sheltering. She had defied instinct. She had waited, searched, and believed. And now, with her son safely beside her, she carried not just him, but the sacred story of what it meant to hold on when every voice in nature tells you to let go. Her devotion had redrawn the path beneath their feet. They didn't need to find the same trail they had lost, because the new one they were making, together, was stronger, softer, and somehow more true. It wasn't made from fear, it was built from love. And that love, steady, silent, and wild, wrapped around them like the snowfall that once threatened to take everything away. But now it fell softly, not as a warning, but as a reminder that they had made it through, that against all odds the smallest, weakest heart had remembered its way, that the mother who had once roared in desperation had become the warmth that lit the dark. Step by step, they carved a new rhythm into the earth, one born not from fear, but from the kind of bond no storm could undo. They paused at every clearing, not to rest, but to honor what had been survived. Their eyes spoke what words never could, that no distance, no cold, no silence could erase the truth of their love. Because love, when held through darkness, becomes more than emotion. It becomes instinct. It becomes the compass. And that's what they had become for each other. Not just mother and son, not just survivors, but a home, a promise, a living testament that even in the wildest, cruelest winter, love can still bloom, ferocious, unstoppable, eternal. And as the storm finally gave way to the stillness of dawn, they stood together against a horizon that no longer felt so far. The forest that had once echoed with silence now breathed with life, reshaped by their return. And though the journey had nearly broken them, it had also rebuilt them into something unshakable. She looked down at the cub who had once been too small, too lost, too weak to survive on his own, and saw instead the strength he had carried all along, the strength to remember, the strength to keep going, the strength to believe that love would find him again. And he looked up at the mother who had never truly left, who had fought not just the cold, but the aching pull of fear and time, and had chosen again and again to stay. That reunion, quiet and unspectacular to the world outside, was everything to the world they had built between them. Not loud, not triumphant, but sacred. Because real survival isn't marked by the battles we escape. It's marked by the ones we return to, with open hearts, with softer eyes, with a love that doesn't demand to be seen to shape everything around it. And in that snow-covered clearing, where love had once been lost, it was now written, everywhere. If this story moved you, imagine how many more hearts it could reach. Share it with someone who believes in the power of love, memory, and finding your way back. And tell us in the comments, what would you hold on to no matter the storm? Subscribe for more stories that remind us, the ones who stay change everything.